This is Dr. Fraser Mitchell from Botany, and he's going to talk about plants and the Irish environment.
Okay, so I'm the coordinator for a field trip we run for our junior sophisters students. So it is, these are a big class of science students who've spent 2 years together as freshman students, and then they separate out into their disciplines. And many of them have never really been outside very much in the sort of habitats we're going to be lecturing them to. So the very first week we take them out, we want to bring them to a range of different habitats so that they familiarize themselves with them. So when they're sitting in lectures, they have some context. And it's also very useful for sort of social bonding, actually. It's very useful. So we run it over the first week of term. And of course, with COVID coming along, last year, we could see we were going to have a problem. And so we actually had to run it through Blackboard. So this is what, instead of having a meet and greet, this is what the students were greeted with. And so we had various sort of sessions on the Blackboard site with Collaborate, where we could actually talk to them like we're talking today, I suppose. But the thing was, how did we give them the field trip experience when they're all sitting in their bedrooms at home? And in the few months coming up to that, what we'd actually been doing was something different, which was we developed this thing called 5 in 5. It's really spearheaded by Jenny Mathelaine, who's the professor of botany. And the idea was to make short little videos, which were 5 minutes long, in different sorts of habitats. And we would examine 5 of the iconic plant species and tell people about them. So we were in the process of doing that. And so then we said, oh, we'll take this opportunity to gather material for our field trip. So for example, I was doing one on 5 peatlands plants, and you can link into these on the Botanic Gardens website. There's lots of them now. But when we were up there, we just did all the filming that I would have done in the field trip. So we did about 6 or 7 5 to 10 minute video clips, which we then used for each of the days in the field trip for each of our habitats, so that students could get an experience of the site. And I suppose one thing you're interested in is sort of assessments and stuff. And I suppose one thing I always go back to the reason for assessments, and students see assessments as a way of them being ranked and marked. And I suppose that's what we use them for too. But in fact, for that reason, if something isn't marked, sometimes students don't engage in it. And so we use assessments as a way of getting student engagement. So the actual marks awarded for something could be pretty trivial, but if there's marks, they'll do it, really. So that was an important sort of imperative in the way we planned this. But the sorts of things we were doing with them remotely was things like getting them to collect plants in their locality and completing worksheets, which we could set up generic ones. I did one for alien invasive plants, which worked extremely well with a class of 85 students. And I only had 1 student contacting me because they were struggling, which I was impressed with. Again, to ensure they looked at videos, we did with MCQs, pretty standard stuff. We gave them data calculations. But then we did some novel things for that field trip. We actually made some videos in certain habitats, in woodland habitats actually, where there was no voiceover. And so in fact, that was part of the exercises. They actually then had to supply the voiceover to explain the aspects of the habitat. So that was what they did, and then they had to upload that. And we got them to do site assessments and stuff. So that's really focusing in on what we were doing for that particular trip. But I suppose really one thing that you're particularly interested in today is sort of what we're doing sort of on, going forward and using online resources. And one of the things we actually used that trip, we put together that remote one, which last time we ran that trip, we ran it in person, which was fine. But and we intend to do that in future. But in fact, you always get students who miss these trips for various reasons, but it's the beginning of the academic year. And in fact, it's very hard for them to repeat it. And so we actually use the online resource as a substitute for those students, and they seem to work well. The other thing in our school, and you'll be hearing from geography as well, we run about 20 field trips a year in the whole School of Natural Sciences. And about half of those are overseas, mostly in Europe, but we run 2 trips to Africa, for example. And the video footage we take is very useful in preparation for field trips, because there's a lot of trepidation, which often students are reluctant to discuss and admit. But many of them just haven't been to these areas, and they're particularly nervous. And it is really very useful to show them the sorts of habitats and situations they're going to be in. So we use that in trip preparation. The other thing we can do with plants is you can use mobile phones to take photographs of plants and identify them in the field, which was something we poo-pooed in the past because it wasn't the way we like people doing it, but it's there now. So we've actually embraced that to a certain extent. And also there is a lot of citizen science on recording organisms in different locations. So you take a photograph and it can be a plant or an animal, and then it's geo-referenced and it's put into these big websites. There's one called GBIF, for example, which maps globally where things are found. And what's really important, though, is if you can verify what you've identified. And so because we're there with staff that are experts in those areas, we can then get the students to upload a lot of verified records, which is quite useful. We also, online resources, a lot of plants are now being genetically identified, I suppose, and we've got a lot of genetic material. So we have a colleague who uses that as an exercise, an online resource, where they get genetic code and they have to try and identify the plants and see if they get the same result they would using the traditional methods. I put in drone flights in the field, and I'm going to leave that to my colleagues in geography. I wasn't sure they were going to be here when I put this slide together, but they use drones a lot for their field work, and so I'll leave them to talk about that. Another thing that's useful both before and after field trips, and sometimes when you're out on them, is Google Earth does time series. You can look at photographs of different age, aerial photography and satellite imagery of different dates, which is very useful in habitats, particularly coastal habitats. You can see how they've changed over time. And the final thing is actually field trip assessment, getting the students to produce videos themselves. And in fact, what we've purchased now is a little sort of handheld, it's like a tripod that you hold your mobile phone in, but it's got a microphone with the sort of furry stuff on it. And what we found is if you just use your phone on a windy day, it's impossible to hear what's going on. And these little microphones are really very effective. And so we give these to students and let them generate video material. And in fact, there was one course that was done just a few weeks ago where they were surveying sites in the Phoenix Park. And they were given the option to produce a written report or produce a video or produce a blog of some sort. And the majority, quite a lot of the students picked the video end. And it was actually quite interesting that I was talking to the person who ran this, I wasn't involved, but said all the students who had lens reports picked the video option, and they found it, and she got a lot of feedback from them. They found that a much more rewarding way of doing an assessment using the video. So it was quite interesting that worked really well. And it's something that I think we will use more in the future as well. So that was a sort of very quick run through really of what we've been up to and where we're going on this. And I'm really looking forward to learning more from my colleagues and picking up more tricks. But it's something that we're just starting out on this, and it's something we will definitely be building on. And we learn a lot from the students because they're much more tech savvy than us with a lot of these things, so which is great.